The History of Islam, From Muhammad to the Modern World, Complete History Documentary. Chapter 1. The Birth of Islam and the First Caliphate in the 7th century. A new religious movement emerged from one of the most remote regions of the ancient world, the deserts of Arabia. At the time, few could have imagined that this movement would eventually transform the political, cultural, and religious landscape of an enormous part of the world. Today, Islam is the second most widely practiced religion on earth. But its story begins in the Arabian city of Mecca, where a merchant named Muhammad was born around the year 570. Muhammad came from the Quraysh tribe, one of the most influential tribes in Mecca. According to Islamic tradition, around the year 610, Muhammad was meditating in a cave near Mecca when he began receiving revelations from the angel Gabriel. These revelations would continue over many years. Eventually, they would form the basis of the Quran, the sacred scripture of Islam. The spiritual truth of Muhammad's message is ultimately a matter of faith, but from a historical perspective, the consequences of that message would be extraordinary. At first, Muhammad did not preach publicly to the entire population of Mecca. He shared his message privately with members of his family and a small circle of trusted friends. At the heart of his teaching was a simple but revolutionary idea: there is only one God. Muhammad also called for moral reform and urged people to abandon injustice, corruption, and the worship of multiple gods. The central concept was submission to the will of God. This submission became known as Islam. Those who accepted Muhammad's message became known as Muslims. For a time, the new religious community remained relatively small, but Muhammad eventually began preaching publicly. His message attracted devoted followers, many of whom would become known as the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet. At the same time, his preaching challenged the established religious and social order of Mecca. The powerful Quraysh saw Muhammad's growing movement as a threat. The conflict was not simply religious. Mecca's political and economic system was closely connected to its traditional religious practices. As Muhammad's followers grew in number, tensions intensified. Eventually, the disagreement became open conflict. The early Muslim community faced persecution and warfare. It was during this broader period of struggle that the concept of jihad began to take shape. The word could describe the personal struggle to live according to God's will, a struggle involving moral discipline, faith, and personal effort. It could also refer to physical armed struggle undertaken in the name of the faith. After years of conflict, Muhammad and his followers eventually prevailed. By the time of Muhammad's death in 632, much of the Arabian Peninsula had joined the movement he had founded. What had begun as a small religious community in Mecca had become something far more powerful. Islam was now both a religious movement and a political community. But Muhammad left behind no universally accepted system for choosing his successor. This created one of the most important questions in Islamic history: who would lead the Muslim community after the Prophet? One of Muhammad's closest companions, Abu Bakr, was chosen as the first caliph. The word caliph meant successor or representative, and the caliph became the political leader of the expanding Muslim community. Abu Bakr's leadership was immediately tested. After Muhammad's death, several Arabian tribes attempted to break away from the new political order. Abu Bakr responded with military campaigns that reasserted the authority of the caliphate across Arabia. With Arabia brought back under central control, the direction of expansion changed. The armies of the new Islamic State began moving beyond the peninsula. Under Abu Bakr and his successor Umar, Arab armies confronted the two great powers that dominated the Middle East, the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Empire. Both had been weakened by decades of devastating warfare against each other. Their armies, economies, and populations had been exhausted. Then came the Arab armies. Moving with remarkable speed, Muslim forces launched a series of successful campaigns. Territory after territory fell. Syria was conquered. The Levant was brought under Muslim control. Egypt followed. And in the east, the powerful Sasanian Empire began to collapse. The scale of these victories was extraordinary. Within only a few decades, the political map of the Middle East had been transformed. But conquest did not automatically mean conversion. The populations living in these newly conquered territories were overwhelmingly Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian. Under the new Muslim rulers, these communities became subjects of the Islamic State. They were required to pay taxes, but they were generally permitted to continue practicing their religions. There were relatively few forced conversions during the early period, nor was there widespread active preaching aimed at immediately converting every conquered population. As a result, political expansion happened much faster than religious conversion. The Islamic State could control a territory long before the majority of its inhabitants became Muslim. This distinction would become one of the most important features of Islam's expansion. The armies of the Caliphate had created an enormous empire, but the religion itself would spread through a much slower and more complicated process. Meanwhile, the Muslim community was developing its own institutions and sacred traditions. The Quran had initially been preserved primarily through oral recitation, supported by various written compilations. During the reign of Caliph Uthman, the Quran was organized into a standardized written text. This became the foundation of the Quran used by Muslims around the world. Yet, while the new Islamic empire was expanding outward, political tensions were growing within it. The question of leadership remained deeply sensitive, and eventually, those tensions would explode into civil war. In 656, Caliph Uthman was murdered. Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali, was then chosen as caliph, but not everyone accepted his authority. Muawiyah, the powerful governor of Syria and a relative of Uthman, challenged Ali's leadership. The dispute triggered the first fitna, the first major civil war within the Islamic community. The conflict would have consequences far beyond the struggle for political power. It would eventually create one of the most important divisions in the history of Islam, the division between Sunni and Shia, and that division would shape the Muslim world for centuries to come. The Islamic faith had begun in the deserts of Arabia. Within only a few decades, its political power had expanded across much of the Middle East. But the greatest challenges facing the new religion were no longer simply external. They were beginning to come from within. Chapter 2. The First Civil Wars and the Expansion of the Caliphate. Death of Caliph Uthman in 656 had plunged the rapidly expanding Islamic State into a crisis. Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, had become caliph, but his authority was contested by Muawiyah, the governor of Syria and a relative of the murdered Uthman. The struggle between them became the first fitna, the first great civil war within the Muslim community. This was more than a dispute between two political leaders. It raised a fundamental question that would remain at the heart of Islamic history: who had the legitimate right to lead the Muslim community? Ali was eventually assassinated in 661 by a member of a radical faction. The Umayyad dynasty then seized power. Muawiyah became the dominant political figure, and the capital of the Caliphate was moved to Damascus. The new dynasty would rule over an empire that continued to expand at remarkable speed. But the conflict surrounding Ali did not disappear. Instead, it would become increasingly connected to the religious identity of different Muslim communities. In 680, Ali's son Hussein, the grandson of Muhammad, rose in opposition to Umayyad authority. Hussein and his small group of followers were confronted by a much larger Umayyad force. At Karbala, Hussein and his followers were massacred. For Shia Muslims, Karbala became one of the defining tragedies of Islamic history. It helped transform Shiism from a political movement centered on the supporters of Ali into a distinct branch of Islam. Shia Muslims came to place particular importance on the leadership of Muhammad's descendants. Sunni Muslims, meanwhile, looked to the Prophet's traditions, his companions, and the established practices of the wider Muslim community. The division between Sunni and Shia would endure for centuries. But despite these internal conflicts, the political expansion of the Islamic world continued. By the late 7th century, the Umayyads had restored their authority and resumed the conquest of North Africa. Muslim armies advanced steadily westward. Among the peoples they encountered were the Berbers of North Africa. Over time, many Berber communities converted to Islam, and one Berber convert would become central to the next great stage of Islamic expansion. His name was Tariq. In the early 8th century, Tariq led Muslim forces across the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Iberian Peninsula. The enormous rock overlooking the strait became known as Jebel Tariq, the Mountain of Tariq. Centuries later, its name would become Gibraltar. Tariq's army confronted the Visigothic kingdom that controlled much of Iberia. He defeated the Visigoth king Roderick. The victory opened the way for a rapid Muslim advance across the peninsula. Within a relatively short period, much of Spain came under Muslim rule. The Islamic world now stretched across an extraordinary distance. From the Atlantic coast of Iberia and North Africa, Muslim territories extended eastward through Egypt, Syria, Persia, and Central Asia toward the borders of modern Pakistan. Yet this enormous empire was not populated exclusively by Muslims. In many regions, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and other religious communities remained the majority. The process of conversion was gradual. But another problem was emerging. The Arab ruling elite often treated non-Arab converts as socially inferior. Across Persia, North Africa, and Central Asia, resentment toward Arab political dominance continued to grow. This tension would eventually threaten the Umayyad dynasty itself. In 747, rebellion erupted in Khorasan. The Abbasid family, claiming descent from Muhammad's uncle Abbas, emerged as the leaders of the revolt. Their movement attracted support from different groups who opposed Umayyad rule. 3 years later, in 750, Abbasid forces defeated the Umayyad army at the Battle of the Zab. The Umayyad dynasty was systematically destroyed. Almost the entire ruling family was eliminated. But one Umayyad prince escaped. His name was Abd al-Rahman. He fled westward across North Africa and eventually reached Iberia. There, in 756, he established an independent Umayyad emirate centered on Cordoba. The Islamic world was now divided between rival political centers. In the east, the Abbasids established a new dynasty. In the west, the surviving Umayyads created their own independent state. The Abbasids soon built a new capital. Its name was Baghdad. Located along the Tigris River, Baghdad would become one of the greatest cities of the medieval world. Under Abbasid rule, the Islamic world entered an extraordinary period of intellectual and cultural development. This era would later become known as the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars made major advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, philosophy, and other fields. Knowledge from different civilizations flowed into the Islamic world. Greek, Persian, Indian, and other intellectual traditions were translated, studied, preserved, and developed further. But the Abbasid era was not simply an age of scientific achievement. Islam itself continued to evolve. Shi'ism became increasingly established as a distinct branch of Islam. Different Shia traditions emerged, including Twelver, Ismaili, and Zaydi Shi'ism. At the same time, Sufi movements began to emphasize inner spirituality, personal devotion, and detachment from worldly distractions. Sufi mystics would later play an important role in bringing Islam to distant regions. By the 10th century, much of Persia, Egypt, and Syria had become Muslim. But conversion was not driven by a single factor. For some, conversion was a sincere spiritual decision. For others, becoming Muslim offered practical advantages. It could improve access to business networks, it could provide greater social status, and it could open opportunities within the political structures of Muslim-ruled societies. Even so, the Islamic world remained deeply religiously diverse. Large Christian and Jewish communities continued to live throughout the territories ruled by Muslim dynasties. Islam had therefore not spread simply by replacing every existing religion. Instead, it developed alongside older faiths and cultures. And beyond the political borders of the caliphate, another force was carrying Islam even farther: trade. Muslim merchants were traveling across enormous commercial networks. They crossed the Sahara and the Sahel. They sailed along the East African coast. They traveled through Central Asia, and they crossed the Indian Ocean. With them came not only goods, but also languages, ideas, customs, and religion. Islam was beginning to travel beyond the boundaries of the great caliphates. It was becoming a global faith. In West Africa, Muslim merchants followed the great trans-Saharan trade routes. As local rulers and elites converted, cities such as Timbuktu, Gao, and Kano would eventually emerge as centers of Islamic learning and culture. Along the East African coast, Muslim merchants established trading hubs in regions that today include Kenya, Tanzania, and Zanzibar. These ports became part of a vast Indian Ocean commercial network. From East Africa and Arabia, the trade routes connected to India and Southeast Asia. The same networks that carried silk, gold, spices, and other goods also carried Islam. By this point, the religion that had begun in 7th century Arabia had traveled thousands of miles. It had crossed deserts, it had crossed seas, and it had entered societies with languages, cultures, and traditions completely different from those of Arabia. But Islam's expansion was entering another decisive phase. In Central Asia, Turkic peoples were converting to Islam. One group in particular would soon dominate much of the Middle East. They were the Seljuks. Their rise would bring them into conflict with the Byzantine Empire. It would also set the stage for the Crusades. The Islamic world was about to enter another turbulent era. Chapter 3. The Islamic Golden Age and the global spread of Islam's rise of the Abbasids marked the beginning of a new era in Islamic history. At the heart of this new world stood Baghdad. Founded along the Tigris River, the city quickly grew into one of the greatest centers of civilization in the medieval world. Physicians, mathematicians, astronomers, philosophers, engineers, and translators gathered in a city that connected East and West. Under Abbasid rule, the Islamic world experienced an extraordinary period of intellectual and cultural development. This era would become known as the Islamic Golden Age. But the importance of the Golden Age was not simply that Muslim scholars produced new discoveries. The Islamic world had become a bridge between civilizations. Ancient Greek philosophical works were translated into Arabic. Persian traditions of government and administration were absorbed into the new Islamic civilization. Indian mathematical knowledge traveled westward. Scholars studied, debated, preserved, and expanded knowledge inherited from earlier civilizations. In mathematics, Muslim scholars made major advances in algebra and arithmetic. In astronomy, they observed the heavens, developed astronomical tables, and improved methods for measuring the movements of celestial bodies. In medicine, physicians established hospitals, developed medical encyclopedias, and refined techniques for diagnosing and treating disease. Philosophers debated questions about reason, faith, existence, and the nature of knowledge. The intellectual world of Baghdad became part of a much larger network. But while the Abbasid capital flourished, Islam was also changing beyond Baghdad. Different religious traditions continued to develop. Sunni Islam became the dominant tradition across much of the Muslim world. Shiism developed its own theological and intellectual institutions, and Sufism became an increasingly influential expression of Islamic spirituality. Sufism placed particular emphasis on the inner relationship between the believer and God. Sufi teachers and mystics often traveled from one region to another. They established communities, schools, and religious networks. And eventually, these spiritual traditions would become one of the most important mechanisms through which Islam spread into new societies. But Islam was not spreading only through scholars and mystics. It was also spreading through commerce. The Muslim world was connected by an enormous network of trade routes. To the south, caravans crossed the Sahara and the Sahel. To the east, merchants traveled through Central Asia along the Silk Roads. To the southeast, ships crossed the Indian Ocean using seasonal monsoon winds. These networks connected societies that were separated by thousands of miles. And merchants carried more than merchandise. They carried their religion. In West Africa, Muslim merchants traveled along the Great Trans-Saharan trade routes. Gold from West Africa was exchanged for salt and other goods from the north. Major trading centers developed along these routes. As Muslim merchants established permanent communities, Islam gradually gained influence among local populations. Political rulers also began to recognize the advantages of connecting themselves to the wider Islamic world. Some converted to Islam. Their courts began employing Muslim scholars and administrators. Mosques and schools were established, and Islamic law and scholarship became part of the political and cultural landscape. Over time, powerful Muslim states emerged in West Africa. But the spread of Islam across Africa followed different patterns in different regions. In many places, conversion happened gradually. Local traditions remained important. Islam became intertwined with existing cultures rather than simply replacing them. Further east, another branch of the Islamic trading world was developing. Muslim merchants were sailing across the Arabian Sea toward the coast of East Africa. They established trading communities along the coast of modern Kenya and Tanzania. Ports such as those found in the Swahili world became important centers of international trade. These coastal cities were connected to Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. Ships traveled with the monsoon winds. Merchants exchanged gold, ivory, spices, textiles, ceramics, and other valuable goods. And again, Islam traveled with them. Over time, Islamic culture became deeply established along parts of the East African coast. But the Indian Ocean was even larger than the African coast. Muslim sailors continued eastward. They reached India. They established trading communities throughout the Indian subcontinent. And eventually, they entered Southeast Asia. This was one of the most remarkable developments in the history of Islam. The religion had originated in an Arabian trading city. Now, centuries later, it was becoming established in societies thousands of miles away. In Southeast Asia, trade played a particularly important role. Muslim merchants from Arabia, Persia, India, and other regions interacted with local rulers and communities. Over time, some rulers converted to Islam. When rulers adopted the faith, their political influence could help spread Islam through their territories. Muslim sultanates eventually emerged in parts of Southeast Asia. Islam became particularly influential in regions of modern Indonesia and Malaysia. Yet once again, conversion was gradual. Local traditions did not simply disappear. Instead, Islamic beliefs and institutions interacted with existing cultures, languages, customs, and political systems. This ability to adapt to different societies would become one of the defining characteristics of Islam's global expansion. By now, Islam had become much more than the religion of Arabia. It was a civilization connected by shared beliefs, sacred texts, legal traditions, trade networks, scholarship, and pilgrimage. A Muslim in North Africa could participate in the same broader religious world as a Muslim in Persia. A scholar in Baghdad could communicate with intellectuals thousands of miles away. A merchant from Arabia could establish a community on the coast of East Africa. And a traveler from Central Asia could continue south toward India. The Islamic world was becoming increasingly interconnected. But this interconnectedness did not mean political unity. The Abbasid Caliphate was gradually losing its direct control over distant territories. Independent dynasties emerged. Regional rulers gained greater power. Political fragmentation became increasingly common. And in Central Asia, a new group was rising. They were Turkic peoples who had entered the Islamic world through migration, military service, and conquest. Among them were the Seljuks. The Seljuks converted to Islam and built a powerful state. Their armies expanded into Persia, Iraq, Syria, and Anatolia. In 1055, the Seljuks entered Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliph remained an important religious symbol, but real political and military power increasingly belonged to the Seljuk sultans. This created a new political structure within the Islamic world. The caliph could represent religious authority. The sultan could control the army and the government. But the Seljuk advance would soon bring them into direct confrontation with the Byzantine Empire. In 1071, the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan confronted the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV at the Battle of Manzikert. The Byzantine army was defeated. The victory opened much of Anatolia to Turkish settlement and Muslim expansion. For the Byzantine Empire, it was a devastating turning point. For the Seljuks, it opened the door to a new homeland. And for Christian Europe, it created a growing sense of danger. Within a few decades, calls for military intervention in the eastern Mediterranean would become increasingly powerful. The Crusades were about to begin. The Islamic Golden Age had connected civilizations through knowledge and trade. But now, the Islamic world was entering another era defined by warfare. Seljuks, Crusaders, regional dynasties, and rival Muslim rulers would fight for control of the most important cities of the Middle East. And from these conflicts, one of the most famous figures in Islamic history would eventually emerge. His name was Saladin. Chapter for Seljuks, Mongols, Crusades, and the rise of the Ottomans. By the 11th century, the Islamic world had become vast, wealthy, and culturally diverse, but politically, it was increasingly fragmented. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad still represented an important symbol of Islamic authority, yet powerful regional rulers controlled much of the actual territory. Among the most important were the Seljuks. Originally a Turkic people from Central Asia, the Seljuks had converted to Islam and gradually built a powerful empire. Their armies expanded across Persia, Iraq, Syria, and Anatolia. In 1055, the Seljuks entered Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliph remained in the city, but real political and military authority increasingly belonged to the Seljuk sultans. The distinction between the caliph and the sultan became an important feature of medieval Islamic politics. The caliph represented religious legitimacy. The sultan controlled armies and governed territories. But the Seljuks were also expanding into Byzantine territory. In 1071, Sultan Alp Arslan confronted the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV at the Battle of Manzikert. The Byzantine army suffered a devastating defeat. The consequences were enormous. Much of Anatolia became increasingly open to Turkish settlement. Over the following decades, Turkic peoples established themselves throughout the region. Anatolia, once the heartland of the Byzantine Empire, was gradually transformed into a predominantly Muslim and Turkish political landscape. The Byzantine emperor appealed to Western Christian powers for assistance. At the same time, religious tensions between the Christian West and the Muslim-controlled Eastern Mediterranean were growing. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for a military expedition to the Holy Land. The First Crusade began. Thousands of European knights and soldiers traveled east. Their stated goal was to reclaim Jerusalem and other holy sites from Muslim rule. In 1099, Crusader forces captured Jerusalem. They established several Christian states in the eastern Mediterranean. The conquest was accompanied by extreme violence. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem were massacred. For the Muslim world, the loss of Jerusalem was a profound shock. But the Islamic response was not immediate. The region remained politically divided among different Muslim rulers. Over time, however, a powerful leader began to unite Muslim territories in the region. His name was Salah ad-Din, better known in the West as Saladin. Born into a Kurdish family, Saladin rose through the military and political world of the Middle East. He eventually gained control of Egypt. Then he expanded his authority into Syria and other territories. His goal was to unite Muslim forces against the Crusader states. Gradually, he succeeded. By the late 12th century, Saladin had created a powerful political coalition. Then, in 1187, his forces confronted the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin. The Crusader army was decisively defeated. The road to Jerusalem was open. Saladin recaptured the city. Unlike the Crusader conquest nearly a century earlier, the city was not subjected to a general massacre. The fall of Jerusalem shocked Christian Europe. A new crusade was launched. Among its leaders was the English king Richard the Lionheart. The Third Crusade produced years of warfare between Richard and Saladin. But neither side achieved complete victory. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, while Christian pilgrims were allowed access to the holy sites. The Crusades would continue in different forms for centuries. But they were only one part of a much larger transformation taking place across Eurasia. Far to the east, another power was rising, the Mongols. Beginning in the early 13th century under Genghis Khan, Mongol armies conquered enormous territories across Asia. Their military campaigns eventually reached the heartlands of the Islamic world. In 1258, Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, led a massive Mongol invasion toward Baghdad. The city was surrounded. After a short siege, Baghdad fell. The destruction was catastrophic. The Abbasid Caliphate was effectively brought to an end. The city that had once represented the intellectual and political heart of the Islamic world was devastated. For many Muslims, the Mongol invasion was one of the greatest disasters in Islamic history. Yet the long-term consequences were more complicated than they first appeared. The Mongols did not remain permanently outside the Islamic world. Some Mongol rulers eventually converted to Islam. One important example was Berk Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the Golden Horde. His conversion strengthened connections between Mongol political power and the Muslim world. Over the following generations, other Mongol rulers and their populations also adopted Islam. The conquerors were gradually becoming part of the civilization they had once attacked. At the same time, Islam continued spreading through trade and political expansion. In Southeast Asia, Muslim merchants had already established communities along important maritime routes. Local rulers increasingly recognized the political and economic advantages of joining the wider Islamic trading world. Muslim sultanates emerged in parts of Southeast Asia. On the island of Sumatra, the Samudra Pasai Sultanate became an important center of Islamic commerce and scholarship. Later, Muslim political states developed in Java and other parts of the region. Again, Islam spread through a combination of trade, political influence, scholarship, and personal conversion. It did not arrive in Southeast Asia through a single military conquest. Instead, it became embedded gradually within local societies. Meanwhile, Sufi traditions continued to expand across the Muslim world. Sufi teachers emphasized personal devotion, spiritual discipline, and the search for a deeper relationship with God. Their teachings often adapted to local cultures. This helped Islam establish roots in societies far beyond the traditional heartlands of the Middle East. By the 14th century, the Islamic world was once again undergoing major political change. The Mongol invasions had destroyed some old centers of power. The Crusader states were weakening, new Turkish states were emerging in Anatolia, and among these small states was one that would eventually become one of the greatest empires in world history. Its founder was Osman. The state he established became known as the Ottoman Empire. At first, the Ottomans controlled only a small territory in northwestern Anatolia, but their strategic position was extraordinary. They stood directly on the frontier between the Muslim Turkish world and the Byzantine Empire. Under Osman and his successors, the Ottomans expanded rapidly. They crossed into southeastern Europe. They conquered territories in the Balkans. Bulgaria and Serbia were eventually brought under Ottoman influence. Muslim rule now extended deep into Europe. As the Ottoman state expanded, Islam spread among parts of the population. Conversion was influenced by many factors. For some, it was religious conviction. For others, political opportunity, economic advantages, or access to government positions could make conversion attractive. The Ottoman state developed a sophisticated political and administrative system capable of governing people of different religions. But the greatest prize remained Constantinople. For centuries, Constantinople had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It was one of the most strategically important cities on Earth. The city controlled major trade routes between Europe and Asia. It was also the symbolic heart of the Eastern Roman Empire and the center of Orthodox Christianity. In 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II launched his final assault. After a prolonged siege, Ottoman forces broke through the city's defenses. Constantinople fell. The Byzantine Empire came to an end. For the Muslim world, the conquest was a monumental achievement. For Christian Europe, it was a profound shock. Mehmed II transformed Constantinople into the capital of the Ottoman Empire. The city would eventually become known as Istanbul. The Ottoman state was no longer simply a regional Turkish kingdom. It had become a major imperial power spanning Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and the Ottomans were only one part of a larger transformation. Across Persia, another powerful Muslim dynasty was rising. In India, another Muslim empire was taking shape. And across Southeast Asia, Islam was becoming increasingly established. The great age of Muslim empires was beginning. The Ottomans would dominate much of the Islamic world. The Safavids would reshape Persia, and the Mughals would transform India. Together, these empires would define the next great chapter in the history of Islam. Chapter 5, The Great Muslim Empires, Colonialism, and the Modern World be the 16th century. The Islamic world had entered the age of great Muslim empires. Three powerful states dominated much of the Muslim world: the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire. Each developed its own political system, culture, and interpretation of Islam. Together, they would shape the history of the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia for centuries. The Ottoman Empire was the largest and most enduring of the three. After the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, Ottoman power continued to expand. The empire moved deeper into southeastern Europe. It conquered territories across the Balkans. It expanded southward into the Arab lands. And eventually, Ottoman armies captured Egypt and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The Ottomans now controlled two of the most sacred places in Islam. The Ottoman sultans increasingly presented themselves as protectors of the Muslim world. They also claimed the title of caliph. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire would remain one of the most powerful states on earth. But the Ottoman Empire was not the only great Muslim power of the 16th century. In Persia, a new dynasty was transforming the religious identity of the region. In 1501, Shah Ismail I established the Safavid Empire. He declared Twelver Shi'ism the official religion of the state. This decision would have enormous consequences. Persia gradually became the center of a powerful Shia political and religious tradition. The rivalry between the Sunni Ottomans and the Shia Safavids became one of the defining political conflicts of the Islamic world. The third great Muslim empire was emerging in India. In 1526, Babur, a Central Asian ruler descended from both Timur and Genghis Khan, defeated the Delhi Sultanate. He established what would become the Mughal Empire. The mules eventually ruled over much of the Indian subcontinent. Unlike the Ottoman and Safavid empires, however, the Mughal rulers governed a population in which Muslims were a minority. This created a complex political and religious environment. Others adopted more explicitly Islamic approaches to government. The empire reached one of its cultural peaks under rulers such as Akbar and Shah Jahan. Magnificent architecture emerged. The most famous example would become the Taj Mahal. Islamic, Persian, Central Asian, and Indian cultural traditions blended together to create a distinctive Mughal civilization. Meanwhile, Islam continued spreading beyond the great imperial centers. In Southeast Asia, Muslim sultanates expanded their influence. Malacca became one of the most important trading centers in the region. Islam spread through commerce, political alliances, scholarship, and conversion. But in another part of the Muslim world, the story was moving in the opposite direction. In Iberia, centuries of Muslim political rule were coming to an end. The Christian kingdoms of northern Spain had gradually reconquered territory from Muslim rulers. By the late 15th century, only one major Muslim state remained, the Emirate of Granada. In 1492, Granada surrendered to the forces of Ferdinand and Isabella. The final Muslim political state in Iberia had fallen. The fall of Granada marked the end of nearly 8 centuries of Muslim political rule in much of the Iberian Peninsula. Muslim and Jewish communities subsequently faced increasing pressure to convert or leave. Many were expelled. Others converted, sometimes willingly and sometimes under coercion. The Islamic presence in Spain was dramatically reduced. But while Muslim rule disappeared from Iberia, Islamic power elsewhere remained enormous. The Ottoman Empire continued expanding. The Safavids controlled Persia, the mules ruled much of India, and Muslim merchants continued to operate across Africa and the Indian Ocean. Yet, over the following centuries, the balance of global power began to change. European states were becoming increasingly powerful. Advances in navigation allowed European ships to reach Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and eventually the Americas. European commercial empires began competing directly with Muslim-controlled trade networks. The Portuguese established fortified trading posts around the Indian Ocean. The Dutch, British, and French later built their own overseas empires. Gradually, European powers gained greater control over global commerce. This shift would eventually have enormous consequences for Muslim societies. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire faced increasing military and economic pressure. European states were becoming stronger. The Russians expanded southward into territories inhabited by Muslim populations. The Ottoman Empire lost territory in Europe and around the Black Sea. At the same time, new Islamic reform movements were emerging. In 18th century Arabia, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab promoted a movement that called for a return to what he regarded as the practices of the earliest Muslim community. His teachings became known as Wahhabism. He formed a political alliance with Muhammad ibn Saud. Together, their movement established the foundation of the first Saudi state. The alliance between religious reform and political power would have a lasting impact on the Arabian Peninsula. But the greatest challenge to the Muslim world was coming from Europe. During the 19th century, European colonialism expanded rapidly. France conquered Algeria. Britain established control over Egypt and other territories. European powers expanded across North Africa. Muslim-majority regions of Africa and Asia increasingly came under European domination. The experience of colonialism profoundly affected Muslim societies. For many Muslims, European rule represented political humiliation and cultural domination. Resistance movements emerged across the Muslim world. Some were primarily nationalist, others were explicitly religious. Islam became an important source of identity and resistance. At the same time, Muslim intellectuals debated how their societies should respond to European power. Should Muslim states adopt European technology and political institutions? Should they return to earlier Islamic traditions? Could Islam and modernity coexist? These questions would define much of Muslim political thought in the 19th and 20th centuries. Some reformers argued that Islam was fully compatible with science, education, and modern government. Others called for a return to the practices of the earliest generations of Muslims. These debates helped shape movements such as Salafism, but political events would soon transform the Muslim world even more dramatically. The First World War erupted in 1914. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. After years of war, the empire was defeated. Its territories were divided. The Ottoman state itself was eventually abolished. In its place, the Republic of Turkey was established under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Ataturk pursued a strongly secular vision for the new Turkish state. One of the most dramatic steps came in 1924. The Ottoman Caliphate was abolished. After more than 1,000 years of Islamic history, the institution of the Caliphate had disappeared, but Islam itself did not disappear. Far from it. The 20th century became a period of enormous transformation. Muslim societies experienced nationalism, anti-colonial movements, independence struggles, military coups, revolutions, and wars. In 1945, Indonesia declared independence from Dutch colonial rule. It would eventually become the country with the largest Muslim population in the world. In 1947, British India was partitioned. Pakistan was created as a Muslim-majority state. The partition produced one of the largest migrations in modern history and caused enormous violence. East Pakistan would later become the independent country of Bangladesh. Then came another major turning point. In 1948, the State of Israel was established. The creation of Israel and the wars that followed became central to the political history of the modern Middle East. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict would remain unresolved for generations. Meanwhile, Muslim societies continued to experience political transformation. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile and established the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran became a major center of Shia political Islam. The revolution also demonstrated that religious movements could become powerful forces in modern politics. At the same time, Muslim communities were increasingly spreading beyond traditional Muslim majority regions. Migration brought millions of Muslims to Western Europe, North America, and other parts of the world. Cities such as London, Paris, Berlin, and New York developed large Muslim communities. But the modern era also brought new forms of conflict. Political instability, foreign intervention, authoritarian governments, wars, and economic inequality created fertile ground for radical movements. Some militant organizations adopted extremely violent interpretations of jihad. The most notorious example would emerge at the beginning of the 21st century. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda carried out terrorist attacks against the United States. The attacks killed thousands of people. They transformed international politics. The United States launched the War on Terror. Afghanistan was invaded. Later, Iraq was invaded. And Islam became the subject of intense political debate across the Western world. For many Muslims, the attacks created another painful problem. A small number of extremist groups claim to act in the name of Islam, but hundreds of millions of ordinary Muslims rejected their ideology and condemned their violence. The distinction between Islam as a global religion and violent extremist movements became increasingly important. Yet the challenges facing Muslim societies did not end there. Muslims continued to face conflict and persecution in different parts of the world. Political disputes affected Muslim communities in Russia and China. Religious and ethnic conflicts devastated communities in Myanmar. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict continued. Civil wars and political instability affected countries across the Middle East and Africa. Despite these challenges, Islam continued to grow. By the 21st century, Muslims could be found in virtually every region of the world, from Indonesia to Nigeria, from Turkey to India, from the Middle East to Europe and North America. The story that began in 7th century Arabia had become a global phenomenon. So how did Islam become one of the world's largest religions? The answer is not simply conquest. Military expansion played a major role during the early history of the caliphates. But conquest alone cannot explain the spread of Islam. In many conquered territories, non-Muslim communities continued practicing their religions for centuries. Islam also spread through trade. Merchants carried it across the Sahara, along the East African coast, through Central Asia, across India, and into Southeast Asia. It spread through political alliances. It spread through scholars and educational institutions. It spread through Sufi mystics who traveled from one society to another. And it spread through ordinary people who chose to embrace the faith. Islam also proved remarkably adaptable. As it entered new regions, it interacted with local languages, cultures, traditions, and political systems. The Islam of West Africa developed differently from the Islam of Persia. The Islam of Indonesia developed differently from the Islam of Arabia, yet all remained connected by the Quran, Islamic traditions, shared religious practices, and a common sense of belonging to the worldwide Muslim community. This combination of shared identity and cultural adaptation was one of the greatest forces behind Islam's global expansion. More than 14 centuries after Muhammad's first revelations, Islam remains one of the most influential religious and cultural traditions in human history. Its followers have built cities and empires. They have produced philosophers, scientists, physicians, poets, architects, scholars, merchants, and rulers. They have lived through civil wars, invasions, political collapse, colonialism, revolution, and modernization. And through all of these transformations, Islam has continued to evolve. Today, roughly 2 billion people identify as Muslim. They live across virtually every continent. Their societies are incredibly diverse. There is no single Muslim culture. There is no single Muslim political system. And there is no single experience of being Muslim. But across this enormous diversity remains a shared religious tradition that began in the deserts of 7th century Arabia. The story of Islam is therefore not simply a story of conquest. It is the story of a religious movement that became a civilization that survived the fall of dynasties, survived the destruction of Baghdad, survived the Mongol invasions, survived the collapse of empires, survived colonial rule, and adapted to the modern world, from the deserts of Arabia to the streets of Jakarta, from the mosques of Cairo to the cities of Europe, from the libraries of Baghdad to the universities of the modern world. Islam has become part of the history of countless societies. Its rise was one of the most consequential transformations in human history, and its story is far from over.